The role of privateers in the American Revolution. This will be a conversation about the role of privateers serving on the side of the American forces in the Revolution. We entered a naval war with the country of Britain that had the largest navy at that time in Europe. We had no navy at that time. Some states, such as Massachusetts, had some ships that they controlled, but there was no formal U.S. Navy until 1776. What we did have were citizen patriots who had boats that were armed and who were willing to go out to defend American shipping back and forth and to defend against blockades by the British. A bonus of that was that some of the British ships, the merchantman ships, were in fact taken by the Americans, and that became a source for us of terribly important war material, notably rifles and gunpowder, two things that we were perilously short of. During the course of the war, there would be 64 American naval vessels commissioned. By the end of the war, there were fewer than 25 in service. Some of those had been rented from the owners, some of them had been borrowed, most were returned. By the time of the War of 1812, we were basically without a navy again. The reason for that I will touch on later, but the key figure in that decision was President Jefferson. Although the War for Independence may have been fought primarily on land, victory for the Patriots was predominantly found in the water. The colonies of the 18th century were composed of adept sailors and maritime people. The colonies themselves stretched along the Atlantic coast from far New England down to Georgia, and included the Chesapeake Bay, a very rich source of both produce and of conflict with the British when it was barricaded. Much of the life and industry carried on the waters of the coastal regions were men and boys ably schooled in the rigors of the sea. In the years before the Revolution, a number of Americans had served as privateers, and some indeed in the Royal Navy. And if we think that seems odd, let's remember that George Washington had served as a royal officer himself in the French and Indian War. From the time of hostilities between Great Britain and the colonies, it was realized that the waterways, both inland and ocean, would be decisive in the outcome of the war. As the war progressed, it became more and more evident that fighting ships and maritime communications were crucial to both the British and the American causes. In fact, the first outright resistance to British authority took place on the water. In 1764, the British ship St. John was cruising off Newport, Rhode Island, an anti-smuggling duty. Unhappy at this restriction of their rights, local citizens outfit a sloop and sent out to sink the St. John. Only the arrival of a British man of war, the Squirrel, prevented that attack. In similar protest against harassment in the same year, a crowd of outraged citizens from Newport burned one of the longboats of the British Maidstone, docked in Newport. In 1769, colonists destroyed the armed sloop Liberty. A similar fate awaited another armed vessel, the Gaspé, in 1772. These attacks led up to the 1773 Boston Tea Party. Nicholas Ross states, in the need to provide naval defense during the early American Republic, there was a trade-off between a centrally controlled navy at high direct costs and privateers at little direct cost. Given the incentives facing merchants in the shipping industry, he wrote, the privateers had certain advantages. Why did the United States rely so heavily on public provision of naval defense as opposed to military defense? Well, the result was partly based on private provision of naval defense and partly on a desire not to have too much invested on a permanent basis in a naval force. Booker writes, privateersmen, often overlooked by historians of the Revolution, conducted a substantial part of the activity on the water, including in the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries. They combined patriotism with the hope of profit. Invaluable service to this nation's struggle for independence was rendered by these profit-motivated privateersmen, by some maligned as little more than pirates and others as an unofficial part of the U.S. Navy. One of the motivations of many privateersmen was the sheer excitement of conflict. Those manning privateers were seagoing men by trade. They were Marines, maritime workers. They loved the sea and were dedicated to the freedom of the sea and the cause of freedom. In October 1776, the Massachusetts Assembly had authorized the issuing of letters of marque. These were the licenses required to make such privateering attacks legal, or at least to have a semblance of legality. Other states soon followed the lead, but it was not until March 1776 that the Continental Congress began issuing its own licenses. Their hesitation stemmed in part from a debate about the nature of the naval campaign that they planned to fight, and not in a not irrational fear that any emphasis on privateering would limit the growth of the fledgling Continental Navy. Also, it was not until that spring that Congress felt the split with Britain had become irrevocable, and it was therefore justified in supporting privateering attacks on British shipping. The move demonstrated that both Congress and the individual states who issued letters of marque were no longer merely engaged in a rebellion against British authority, but rather it showed that letters of marque were being issued by a legislature which considered itself wholly independent of Britain, and which was representing its own people in international affairs. In this way, privateering letters of marque helped to emphasize that the American colonies intended to govern themselves. This is why Founding Father John Adams saw the move by Massachusetts as one of the most important legislative acts of the American Revolution. It meant that the decision to have privateering licenses actually predated the formal Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776, although it can be argued that it represented the same in fact. Moss writes, marque and reprisal was a legal authority and a framework provided by princes, monarchs, governments to privateers. Their land-bound counterparts, mercenaries, did not operate under such strict arrangements. They had contracts and conditions of employment, but a privateer was supposed to be acting under official authority of a government or legal entity. Both privateers with their licenses of marque and reprisal and contracted mercenaries exercised their private rights and actions in time and settings before modern states even existed into the age of the Dark Ages. Understanding this can give one appreciation of how deeply the notions of the cause and content of the conflict have changed. We will see from our authors that mark and reprisal rested on the rights of private parties to seek regress or compensation for damaging when governing bodies of whatever form were unable or even unwilling to address these problems. By the late 17th century, mark and reprisal had become more of a means of supplementing the resources and capabilities of the state than for any other purpose. Private means of war fell more and more under state control finally, and only began to change in the late 20th century. So we see that these considerations, not unlike those pondered in Philadelphia some 200 years ago, how does a government of state take advantage of resources provided by private enterprises who want to engage in the resources for these activities for public profit, particularly when the means offered come from entities with shareholders. However, the questions would not end then. What if private actors have the actual capability to wage war without the consent or knowledge of the state or international bodies? It is now a dawning reality in the age of cyber. I will have at the end of this a bibliography, and I hope that you will also be able to see images of some of our fighting ships. Thank you.